Hello students, this is your review for your final exams. Final exams consist of 3 exams. One is on Unit 4 in your book. This is going to be the standard format that you have seen in your previous 3 exams on the previous 3 units. However, you also have 2 assessments that you have to do at the same time. And these are a little bit different because they cover the course in general, not on specific chapters. And there are 10 questions each on the 2 assessments. They count rather heavily on your grade. Each assessment counts 5 points or 5 percentage points on your total grade for the course. There's only 10 questions, so each question is very important. 10 questions on each one of the 2 assessments for a total of 10 percentage points, 10 points on your overall grade. So they are very important. So take your time and think about them carefully. But remember, you have to do all 3 of these on your final exam. Okay, and I'm going to review all 3 now. Okay, the exam on Unit 4, most federal expenditures in Texas go to education and health and human services. But before Texas can get any money from the federal government for these items, they first of all have to commit to spend some money out of their own funds on them. They're called matching funds. And federal funds often come with what are sometimes called strings attached. That simply means that the funds are specified by certain regulations, and the state has to follow the regulations in implementing them to make sure that the money's not wasted or spent on something that they're not supposed to spend it on. Okay, when you look at the whole budget of the legislature, you find that the legislature does not have direct control of most of the money in the state budget. Most of the money is committed. They are already mandatory funds that have already been allocated by law, and the legislature doesn't have much. They would have to change the law itself in order to either allocate more or less money for those programs. Okay, when the state receives money from the federal government for things such as Medicaid or Children's Health Insurance Program, called the CHIPS program, the comptroller will deposit those funds into a fund called federal funds. That's the comptroller's job. And if the funds coming from the federal government or from other sources are not specified, then the money goes into the account for other funds, quote unquote. And if you want to get a picture of the overall budget and expenditures of the state of Texas, you look at the All Funds program, which just shows you all of the funds and what they go for. Okay, 2 types of tax categories would be progressive tax and regressive tax. Progressive tax is where, for example, in the federal income tax, people with lower incomes are taxed at a lower rate, whereas people with higher incomes are taxed at a higher rate. It's called a progressive tax. As your income goes up, your tax goes up. Your tax progresses as your income progresses. But in Texas, the system is generally described as a regressive system because Texas relies heavily on things like the sales tax, which is not progressive. It's the same tax for everyone, regardless of income. So it impacts lower income people harder than higher income people. And it's unlikely that Texas would ever enact a income tax, personal income tax, because there have been 2 constitutional amendments passed that prohibit that. And so the Constitution would have to again be amended in order to permit that. But of course, that's how the federal income tax came about, was through the 16th Amendment to the federal Constitution, which provided authorization for Congress to create a federal income tax which would be progressive. Okay, there is a permanent school fund which is largely funded by the oil and gas revenues that Texas gets from its oil and gas leases, and it's earmarked to go to the universities that are a part of the University of Texas and Texas A&M systems. So in other words, universities like University of Houston would not get any of that money. And the constitutional mandate is that the Texas legislature has to write a budget every 2 years. Now that's kind of hard to do, look 2 years into the future in your crystal ball and see what things are going to be like. It's kind of hard to do, but that's what they have to do. Okay, Texas is required to maintain a balanced budget, meaning that the spending from the general revenue fund cannot exceed projected available revenue. And that is the job of the comptroller. When the legislature proposes a budget, passes a budget, it goes to the comptroller, who then has to certify that he or she believes that there will in fact be enough revenue come in the next 2 years to pay for the appropriations that the legislature wants to make. And if the economy shrinks, then that means that revenue is going to shrink, because if the economy shrinks, people aren't buying as many goods and paying sales tax on them, and so the revenue for the state of Texas for sales tax goes down. So consequently, appropriations have to go down as well. The state is allowed to carry a debt. They can sell bonds, they can have a debt, not more than 5% of their revenue. So they are limited in how much debt they can incur. The process by which the state legislature appropriates money or spends money is called the appropriations process. The Legislative Budget Board, as we have said, is very, very important in the allocation of money and the process of setting financial policy for the state of Texas. It is chaired by the lieutenant governor. It is often said that the lieutenant governor is the most powerful person in the state government, even more so than the governor, because the lieutenant governor not only chairs the Senate and appoints the chairman of the committees and sets the agenda for the Senate, but the lieutenant governor also chairs the Legislative Budget Board, which determines or proposes how much money each state agency is going to get. That is the group that would determine how much money is going to be spent toward higher education. So that has to do with how much tuition you're going to have to pay if you go to a 4-year college. Okay, the biennial revenue estimate, the BRE, is a detailed forecast of total revenue that the state is expected to take in over the next biennium, and this is prepared by the comptroller of the state. Federal matching funds for our program are not dependent upon how much the state also contributes. No, that's false. It is dependent. The more money that the state puts up, the more federal money it will get in matching funds. The Texas Comptroller's Office is predicting declining revenues based on tobacco taxes because the tobacco companies were sued and people stopped buying cigarettes, and so the revenue for tobacco tax has gone down, and that is the projection. Okay, public education is funded both through the Permanent School Fund and the Available School Fund. That's the state funding. But most of the local school districts depend upon, or most of their budget is from property taxes, local property taxes. If you own property within the boundaries of Aldine's ISD, then you have to pay school tax to Aldine ISD. And if your property is also within the boundaries of Lone Star College District, you also pay taxes to Lone Star College District. And because the state requires, or the Constitution requires that the legislature do 2-year budgets, it means that the state legislators really don't have too much time to study items, to study, budget forecasts and so forth before they comprise and write a budget. So they really don't have much time. In terms of per capita spending on education, Texas ranks near the bottom of the country. And we have a low level of public spending per pupil. The three main issues that Texas education has had to deal with is, first of all, funding, money. That's always an issue, always will be. Desegregation, they've had to deal with desegregation over decades, centuries even. And finally, educational excellence, in other words, improving the quality of education and the result of student learning. The U.S. Supreme Court overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson was a case that said that as long as you were providing facilities for both black students and white students, or black people as well as white people in other contexts, that was okay. That satisfied equal protection of the law clause of the 14th Amendment. And that was the law for, like about 50 years, a little over 50 years. But then a landmark case came along called Brown versus Board of Education, which said the opposite. It said that separate but equal does not mean that you simply provide a facility for black people as well as white people, because it's never equal. Because when you separate the races, you are stigmatizing a race that they are not worthy to enjoy the same privileges as the other race. So it's never equal. Separate is never equal. Okay, and so in the 1920s and 30s, the per capita expenditures for black students was much lower than for white students. And it remained so until desegregation occurred. And so efforts to expand civil rights of women, African Americans, and other groups within Texas and in the whole country have been rooted in the 14th Amendment, particularly the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And that's been a very, very significant clause in the Constitution. And it was the basis for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was the basis for the same-sex marriage case recently, just a few years ago. And so it's been a key factor in many decisions of the Supreme Court, extending equal protection rights to minorities. Edgewood Isd versus Kirby was a case whereby the Supreme Court of the state of Texas declared that the educational system in Texas was unconstitutional under the Texas Constitution because it depended upon property taxes. And property taxes, property values in different parts of the state are different. Some parts of the state have lower property values, therefore deriving their money from their tax money from those properties did not produce a lot of revenue. Whereas areas of the state where there was high property values, that produced a high level of revenue, and that was deemed unconstitutional. That was in 1989. So the legislature responded. They came up with a plan. They said, okay, we need to get some contributions from the wealthier districts and spread that money out to the poorer districts. And since they were taking money from the wealthy and giving it to the poor, it was called the Robin Hood Plan. And it worked to a great degree. Statewide scores on the tests that you take to determine your achievement in school, they went up. But they didn't go up that much, and so not enough was being done. Some people advocate vouchers for education, so that parents would have more of a choice of where their children go to school. But that hurts public schools because what that would allow is that parents would be able to go to the tax office of Aldine ISD and say, okay, give me my money back. I want to put Junior in a private school. And so they get the money back, and that hurts public education, and the private schools benefit financially, although there's been debate as to whether the private schools really do a better job than the public schools in educating people. The poverty rate in Texas is, of course, higher than in the rest of the country. Texas determines which children are eligible for reduced price or free lunch based upon the federal poverty guidelines. The federal government issues poverty guidelines determining, given a certain family size, what income represents the threshold, whether you are in poverty or out of poverty. During the 1980s, a growing number of critics alleged that the welfare programs were creating sort of a class of people who were living off of welfare and not doing their best to be self-sustained or self-supporting. Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC, was a program that used federal and state funds to assist children who met certain qualification standards and was replaced by the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TANF program in 1996. And that was called welfare reform because it provided limitations on welfare payments, that you could only get welfare payments for a certain number of years, even over your lifetime. You could not get more than a certain amount. Welfare programs reforms were measured along two dimensions. First of all, the number of people on welfare and the success of getting people into the workforce. Of course, the aim of educational programs and welfare programs are to get people into a position where they can take care of themselves. They get to be better educated. They go to Lone Star College, get more education, they can get better jobs, they can take care of themselves. SSI, Supplemental Security Income, was aimed at people who are disabled or the elderly with low income. Okay, the Medicaid program was created in 1965, and it was a combination of state and federal program to provide health care to the poor. It is known as a non-contributory program because there's no special earmarked tax that is used to pay for it. It's paid for out of the General Revenue Fund of the United States and of the state of Texas, as opposed to a program such as Medicare, which is a contributory program. If you work and get a paycheck, you're going to find that there is a deduction from your earnings for something called Medicare, and also for FDIC, FICA, Federal Insurance Corporation of America. That's Social Security. Those are two programs that are known as contributory programs because there's a specific tax used to pay for it. Although really all programs are contributory because even Medicaid, even though it's designated as non-contributory, we all contribute to it through our general income tax. Okay, the Affordable Care Act of 2020, also known as Obamacare, one of its main goals was to increase access to health insurance coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. Before this was passed, an insurance company could simply turn down a request for insurance coverage for a person who had some medical problems. If you had diabetes, then the insurance company would say, well, you're too much of a risk for us, so we're not going to insure you. Or, okay, we will insure you, but we're going to charge you a higher premium than people who don't have diabetes. Or we're going to exclude from coverage any medical problem that you have which can be related to your diabetes. Okay, they can't do that anymore. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, says, no, you can't do that anymore. Okay, the Medicaid program and Obamacare had a problem. They had a gap between them, that in order to qualify for Medicaid, your income and assets had to be below a certain level, whereas to qualify for Obamacare, your income had to be above a certain level in order to be able to pay part of the premiums. And so there's a gap in between those. And Congress realized that there would be a gap, and they provided for that in the Affordable Care Act. They said, okay, all the states, we're going to expand Medicaid. We're going to tell Congress to provide more money or change the qualification standards to get Medicaid and Obamacare so that there will be no gap. Everybody will have coverage either through Medicaid or through Obamacare, one or the other. Okay, and so they said all states need to do this, and to force them to do this, we're going to say, if you don't do this, we're going to cut off all of your federal medical funds. And so, of course, the states said, they challenged it in court, and the court ultimately said, no, you can't do that. That's being a little too oppressive, a little too much what's called coercive federalism. That's called coercive federalism, where the federal government mandates a state do a certain thing. Okay, and so that was declared unconstitutional. So a lot of states did not sign up for the expanded Medicaid, even though it was essentially free money for them. The federal government was going to put up the money. All the states had to do was distribute it, and of course it would cost them a little money to administrative costs in distributing the money, but basically otherwise it wouldn't cost them hardly any money. But it became political as to which governors of which states did or did not like Obama. And if they did not like Obama, then they say, oh, well, we're not going to participate in that program because that's part of Obamacare, and we don't like that. And that Texas was one of those states, and Texas, to this day, as of the recording of this video, has not opted into the expanded Medicaid program. It's one of only 12 states that have not done that. A lot of the states that originally said, no, we're not going to do it, ultimately did do it, but not Texas. The San Antonio School District was the first to adhere to the Brown versus Board of Education decision and started to desegregate their schools. Okay, there was a 1983 report by the National Commission on Education that essentially condemned the Texas education system as not being adequate education for students in poor school districts, and it did have a effect on Texas, because Texas had a terrible education system, and by what the report said, and so it did have an effect because it caused the state Supreme Court to declare the Texas education system as being unconstitutional under the state constitution. Okay, welfare policy is a joint effort by the state and the federal government, not separate. Okay, supplemental security income did not have anything to do with unemployment insurance. Supplemental security income, as we said, was simply a program to provide some income for elderly people in poverty and other poor people, and also people who were disabled. Okay, when you get certified to receive Medicaid, you're not necessarily approved for life. You can lose your certification if your income goes up, or if you get over your disability, you're able to work or what have you, then your certification can change. There's an act called the Sandra Bland Act, based upon the horrible death of the woman in custody in jail just in Hempstead, Waller County, right outside of us, who it was concluded, although it's disputed, it's concluded that she committed suicide while in jail. She was arrested on a minor traffic offense, but she wound up getting put in jail because she had arguments with the police officer who arrested her. And so it's called the Sandra Bland Act, and it says that any jail death has to be investigated by an independent agency. Okay, felons cannot vote in Texas as long as they're still serving their time. But once they serve their time in full, then they can vote again. This is not true in every state. Some states say, well, once a felon, you can never, ever, ever vote again in this state. But Texas is not like that. They say, okay, once you've done your time, you can vote again. But you can't vote while you're doing your time. If you're sentenced by a judge to probation, what you will need to be doing is you will need to have a steady job, report to your probation officer on a regular basis, and abstain from drug and alcohol use, and pay any fines or restitution that you need to pay. When you are arrested and brought into court and the charges against you are read, it's called an arraignment. That's the name for it. And after the charges are read, the judge will advise you of your rights to counsel, and he will ask you how you plead. You plead guilty, not guilty, or no contest. No contest means that you are not contesting the charges against you, which amounts essentially to a guilty plea. Okay, the Texas legislature is composed of excuse me, we are now entering into the assessments. The first assessment is assessment number 4, and it is 10 questions. They're all multiple choice. Texas legislature is comprised of 150 members of the Texas House of Representatives and 31 members of the Senate. And it's a bicameral legislature. In other words, we have 2 houses of the legislature, just like the U.S. Congress. There's only one state in the nation that is unicameral. That's Nebraska. But that's not on your quiz, so don't worry about that. Okay, but it permits more opportunities to kill or significantly modify a bill, because it has to be looked at twice and voted on twice and approved twice, once in the House and once in the Senate. Okay, who can write a bill? Anyone. As we mentioned before, anyone can write a bill. Only a member of the legislature can actually introduce the bill, but anybody can write a bill, and very often interest groups write a lot of the legislation that comes before the legislature. The governor of Texas has very few formal powers, so it's considered to be one of the weakest of the chief executives of the United States. Of course, the governor does have emergency powers. He or she can declare an emergency and exercise a great deal of power, and we have seen that happen recently. And the post-adjournment veto, again, is that the legislature cannot overturn it, cannot override it, because they're not in session anymore. And the state controller is very important, because he or she gives the legislature their budget. Okay, when the legislature is convening, the state controller will say, okay, boys and girls, here's your allowance. You can't spend more than that. Called the biennial revenue estimate. The Texas Medical Association would be considered a professional interest group, just like lawyers or CPAs. Non-professional interest groups, that doesn't mean that they're inferior, it just means that they don't have a classification as professional, would be like labor unions or chambers of commerce or environmental groups or gun advocacy groups or what have you. Those are all interest groups, but professionals are those who have licenses, like a law license or a medical license, something of that nature. Okay, civil rights groups have had the most success in litigating in federal courts. Lobbyists have a wide range of abilities. They can do almost anything except just literally bribe a member of the legislature. They can provide information to politicians, which is useful to legislators. If I were in the Texas legislature and there was legislation coming before me concerning coal mining, well, I don't know anything about coal mining, so I would want some information from owners of the coal mines and the labor unions that represent the coal miners. I would want some background information from both of them. And they can also write bills, they can testify before legislative committees, and they can entertain politicians. They can take them out to dinner, take them on vacation. So they have a wide latitude. And there are what are called political action committees. Their job is to raise money to support candidates or incumbents for office who favor their views. So the idea is to sort of bundle together individual donations. For example, if I have $100 I want to donate to a particular candidate, that's nice, and the candidate, I'm sure, will appreciate that. But he'll be more impressed if my $100 is bundled together with 1,000 people, and instead of our representatives being able to donate to a political campaign of $100, they're able to offer $100,000. So bundling together, that's what political action committees do. They're referred to in shorthand as PACs. Okay, now we move into the assessment number 5. Okay. And the trend toward the parties moving further apart, Democrats moving more into the liberal left-wing area, and Republicans moving more into the extreme right-wing area. It's called partisan polarization. And Texas Democrats have been relegated into a minority status at the state level since 1994. Up until that time, Democrats controlled if not all, at least the overwhelming majority of state offices. But starting in 1994, the Republican Party started electing, they had already started, but they conclude in dominating state offices. In Texas, at the time of the making of this video, Republicans control every statewide office, from governor on down, and all the judges on the Supreme Court and the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. Okay, primary elections have become more important than the general elections, because if the Republican is likely to win a particular office, say governor, then it's most important for the Republican Party in their primary, who that person's going to be to represent their party. Whoever it is has a good chance of being elected. Not saying that they're going to be elected. It's just that that whoever the Republican nominee is has a strong possibility of winning the election in November, because that's been the trend recently. Okay, sometimes there are intra-party disputes within a party. For example, in the Republican Party, there's a Tea Party wing, which is sort of a very conservative group, and then there's the rest of the party, which is more business-oriented, more moderate, and they are called factions. In the Democratic Party, you have conservative and moderate Democrats, and you have liberal and socialist Democrats. So those are known as factions because they're within a party. Okay, the Democratic Party in Texas is made up of a number of groups, but such as Latinos, African Americans, white liberals in Houston and Austin, but not whites in East Texas. Whites in East Texas don't tend to vote Democratic. Interest groups are most powerful in states that are dominated by one party, because there's no party competition. And so without competition, then the people in elected office can essentially get away with more. Okay, and we talked about the Sunset Advisory Commission. They review every state agency within every 12 years and determine whether the agency is still needed and whether it's doing a good job or whether it needs to be reformed or what. And Texas Supreme Court handles civil appeals. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals here handles criminal appeals. and it typically costs more to run for office if you're running for judgeship in civil court, in the Supreme Court, because that's where the money is. People are suing somebody for millions of dollars, and so the lawyers are getting paid millions of dollars to defend them or to prosecute the case. And so if you want to be a judge, then there's going to be a lot of money flowing into election campaigns. So you're going to have money if you want to have a chance of winning. Okay, so that concludes your review for the final exams, and just remember you have to take all 3 exams in class on the appointed day, and you have to obviously work on your own on all of your exams, on Unit 1, Unit 2, and Unit 3, as well as the final exams, the 3 final exams. Okay, so thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.